In May 1945, two Allied investigators searching for art looted by the Nazis arrived at Hermann Goering's private collection in a Bavarian salt mine. Among the thousands of paintings stored there, they found a previously unknown Vermeer, Christ and the Adulteress, which Goering had personally purchased in 1943 for a sum equivalent to nearly $2 million in today's money. They traced the painting backwards through the wartime art trade until they arrived at a Dutch dealer's records, and then at the studio of a moderately successful Amsterdam society painter named Han van Meegeren. Van Meegeren was arrested as a Nazi collaborator. The penalty for selling a Dutch national treasure to the enemy was death. His defense was the strangest legal defense in 20th century art history. I didn't sell Goering a Vermeer. I sold him a forgery. I painted myself. To prove it, he asked for paint, canvas, and a courtroom. What happened next was either the greatest practical demonstration of art historical chicanery ever performed, or the most elaborate bluff in criminal history, depending on which historian you ask. By the time it was over, Han van Meegeren had transformed himself in Dutch public opinion from suspected Nazi collaborator to national folk hero. He had also made fools of nearly every Vermeer expert alive. This is how he did it, and this is what his forgery should still teach the art world today. Han van Meegeren was born in 1889 in Deventer, Holland. He trained as an architect, switched to fine art, and exhibited his first paintings in the 1910 seconds. He was, by most accounts, technically gifted. He could draw, model, glaze, and varnish with academic discipline. He was also temperamentally out of step with his era. The 1920 seconds and 1930 seconds were the decades of Picasso, Mondrian, Duchamp, and the explosion of European modernism. Critics dismissed academic realist painters like Van Meegeren as anachronisms. By the late 1920 seconds, Van Meegeren had become bitter. He blamed the critics for failing to recognize his talent. He told friends that the modern art establishment was a fraud, that it valued novelty over skill, that anyone who could really paint was being shut out. So he decided to prove it. If the critics couldn't recognize quality in contemporary painting, he reasoned, he would feed them paintings. They would have to recognize forgeries of old masters, so convincing that the leading experts would authenticate them. His chosen target was Johannes Vermeer of Delft. Vermeer was, in the 1930 seconds, a complicated target. He had been almost completely forgotten in the 18th and early 19th centuries. The French critic Théophile Thorberger had rediscovered him in 1866 and championed him as a major Dutch master. By 1930, the surviving Vermeer corpus stood at about 35 paintings, but there was a gap. Scholars believed Vermeer might have had an early religious history phase, a period before his familiar quiet domestic interiors, but no paintings from that phase had been securely identified. Van Meegeren saw the gap and decided to fill it. Forging a 17th century oil painting in the 1930 seconds was not a matter of just painting in a Vermeer style. Modern forensic methods were already advanced. By 1930, X-ray imaging of paintings was standard. Pigment analysis was developing. Solvent testing, where a small swab of solvent applied to a painted surface would soften modern oil paint, but not the 300-year-old oil paint, was already in use. So Van Meegeren had to solve several distinct technical problems. One, canvas. He needed canvases that were genuinely 3 centuries old. He acquired authentic 17th century Dutch paintings, unimportant ones, by minor masters. From junk shops and rural estate sales, he stripped the original paint with sandpaper and solvents, leaving the period-appropriate canvas and stretcher intact. 2, pigments. He needed to use only pigments that would have been available to Vermeer in the 1650 seconds and 60s. No zinc white, no cobalt blue, no synthetic ultramarine. He sourced authentic lapis lazuli, lead white, vermilion, ochres, and bone black. 3, binder. This was the critical problem. Authentic 17th century oil paint hardens over 3 centuries into a glass-like solvent-resistant film. Fresh oil paint, even applied with old pigments to an old canvas, would soften under acetone or alcohol. Any conservator could distinguish the two with a simple swab. Van Meegeren's solution to the binder problem is the technical heart of his entire scheme. After years of experimentation in a rented villa in the south of France, he developed a substitute binder. He used phenol formaldehyde resin, a synthetic plastic precursor that, when mixed with oil pigments and baked at low temperature for several hours, would harden into a film that mimicked centuries-old paint. He would then apply the painting to the old canvas, bake it in a custom oven, roll the surface to induce a network of fine, cracklier cracks, and rub black pigment into those cracks to simulate 3 centuries of dust and varnish accumulation. When the painting came out, even a solvent swab would not soften it. The phenol formaldehyde resin was rock hard. This is, for the record, a chemically extraordinary achievement. Van Meegeren was working with synthetic resins that were barely understood in commercial use in 1932. He worked out the formulations by trial and error, ruined dozens of test paintings, and refined the technique over 5 years. In 1937, Van Meegeren completed his masterpiece. He titled it The Supper at Emmaus. It depicted Christ at the table with 2 disciples after the resurrection, a scene from the Gospel of Luke that Caravaggio had famously painted twice in the early 1600 seconds. Van Meegeren designed the composition to do something specific. He wanted to fill the speculated gap in Vermeer's career, a religious history painting that scholars had been theorizing about for decades. He combined Vermeer's well-known palette of cool blues, golden yellows, and warm flesh tones with a stately Caravaggesque composition. He inserted small Vermeer signatures, the precise rendering of bread crusts, the particular treatment of white tablecloth folds, the heavy-lidded eyes. He did not paint a copy of any known Vermeer. He painted a hypothesis, a what-if Vermeer. He then arranged for the painting to be discovered through a series of intermediaries. The painting was offered to a respected Dutch art lawyer who took it to Abraham Bredius, one of the most influential Dutch art historians of the early 20th century, the author of the standard Vermeer monograph, and the man universally regarded as the leading living Vermeer expert. Bredius, then in his 80s, examined the painting in 1937. He authenticated it as a genuine Vermeer. He published a glowing article in the Burlington magazine, the most prestigious English-language journal of art history, declaring it the masterpiece of Johannes Vermeer of Delft and describing it as perhaps the most beautiful painting of the great master. Other scholars followed. The painting was acquired by the Boijmans Museum in Rotterdam for the equivalent of about $3 million in today's money. It was hailed as one of the most important art historical discoveries of the century. The Boijmans hung it as the centerpiece of a major exhibition. Van Meegeren, watching all this from the sidelines, hidden behind layers of intermediaries, saw exactly what he had hoped to see. The expert who had been the most decisive voice on Vermeer attribution for decades had been completely fooled. But now Van Meegeren had a problem. He had wanted to humiliate the critics. He had not actually planned to confess. The forgery had been sold for an enormous sum, and confessing would mean returning the money he no longer had. So he kept going. He painted another forgery and another. Between 1937 and 1943, Van Meegeren produced at least 7 full-scale Vermeer forgeries, and several additional forgeries in the styles of other Dutch Golden Age painters, including Pieter de Hooch and Frans Hals. He sold them through Dutch dealers for, in total, the equivalent of approximately $30 million in modern money. He bought villas. He bought houses in Amsterdam. He drank heavily, partied, and bought morphine. He was, by 1942, the most successful forger in art history, and almost nobody, not even his closest friends, knew it. In 1942, Holland was under Nazi occupation. The German art trade was running at fever pitch. Hermann Goering, the second most powerful man in the Third Reich and an obsessive art collector, had assembled a personal collection of looted and purchased art that would eventually number in the thousands. Goering's agents in Holland were on the lookout for major Dutch masters. In May 1943, through a chain of dealers, Van Meegeren's forgery, Christ, and the Adulteress was offered to Goering. The price was approximately 1.5 million Dutch guilders, about $2 million in today's money. Goering paid in cash. He also paid in part with 137 Dutch paintings that the Reich had already confiscated from Dutch Jewish collectors. Van Meegeren had effectively traded a single forged painting for over 100 genuine masterpieces, many of them looted from murdered or displaced Dutch Jews. He would not understand the moral weight of that transaction until later. Christ and the Adulteress was crated up and shipped to Bavaria. It joined Goering's collection in Hall, his hunting lodge outside Berlin, and was later moved to the salt mines for safekeeping as Allied bombing intensified. In May 1945, after the German surrender, Allied investigators, including the U.S. Army's so-called monuments men, began cataloging and tracing the looted and purchased art in Nazi collections. Among the works they recovered in the Altasee salt mine in Austria was Goering's previously unknown Vermeer. They traced the sale records back to a Dutch dealer, and then back to the studio of Han van Meegeren. On May 29, 1945, van Meegeren was arrested by Dutch authorities in his Amsterdam villa. The charge was collaboration with the enemy, specifically selling Dutch cultural property to a member of the Nazi leadership. The punishment on conviction was death. Van Meegeren spent the first few weeks in custody refusing to explain himself. Then, 3 weeks into his detention, he made the announcement that would define the rest of his life. He had not sold Goering a Vermeer. He had sold Goering a painting that Van Meegeren, had painted himself in 1942. More than that, he had not painted just one. He had painted 6. The Supper at Emmaus, the masterpiece of the Boijmans Museum that critics had hailed as the greatest discovery of the century, that was a forgery too. So was the Last Supper, so was Christ among the Doctors, so was Head of Christ. The Dutch government's first reaction was disbelief. The art experts who had authenticated Van Meegeren's Vermeers refused to accept they had been fooled. The Boijmans Museum insisted the Supper at Emmaus was genuine. Abraham Bredius had died in 1946. But his fellow Vermeer experts were not prepared to admit that all of them, collectively, had been so completely deceived. Van Meegeren made an offer that they could not refuse. Give me a studio, give me canvas, paint, and witnesses. I will paint you a new Vermeer in front of you, using the same materials and techniques I used in the forgeries you already own. The Dutch authorities agreed. Between July and December 1945, in a guarded studio in Amsterdam, with court-appointed observers and experts watching, Van Meegeren painted a new work in the manner of his Vermeer forgeries. He titled it Jesus Among the Doctors. He prepared his own pigments. He laid down the underpainting. He demonstrated his phenyl formaldehyde resin baking technique. He showed how he aged the surface with rolling and crack induction. The observers, day by day, watched a forgery come into existence before their eyes. By the end, the Dutch experts had no choice. They had to admit that Van Meegeren could in fact paint in the technique of his alleged forgeries, and that the works in the Boijmans and in Goering's collection were almost certainly his work, not Vermeer's. Independent forensic confirmation followed. Chemists analyzed paint samples from the disputed Vermeers and found unmistakable traces of phenol formaldehyde resin, a synthetic substance that did not exist in any form until the early 20th century. Decades after Vermeer's death in 1675, the pigment cobalt blue, which Van Meegeren had inadvertently used in trace quantities in some of the forgeries, because it was a common contaminant in industrial-grade lapis lazuli, sealed the case. Cobalt blue was not isolated as a pigment until 1802. The forgeries were proven beyond any reasonable doubt. On the 29th of October, 1947, Van Meegeren went to trial in Amsterdam. The charge of collaboration had been quietly dropped since he had defrauded rather than collaborated with the Nazis. His actual crime was forgery and fraud. The maximum sentence was 4 years. The court gave him 1 year. He had transformed himself in less than 2.5 years from a Nazi collaborator facing death to a folk hero who had swindled Hermann Goering. The Dutch public adored him. Polls at the time named him one of the most popular men in Holland. Han van Meegeren died on the 30th of December 1947 of a heart attack before he could begin serving his sentence. He was 58. The questions his story raises have not, in my view, been adequately answered in the 80 years since. Question 1. How did the art establishment get it so wrong? The Supper at Emmaus is not, by modern standards, a particularly convincing Vermeer. The faces are stylistically wrong. The hands are stylized in a way that has more in common with Italian 17th century painting than with Vermeer's Delft restraint. The composition is theatrical in ways Vermeer's never were. And yet, Bredius, the man who had spent more time with authentic Vermeers than any living scholar, pronounced it the master's greatest work. The Boijmans paid millions of guilders for it. Other Vermeer experts followed. The explanation, I think, is the one Bredius's contemporaries gave at the time: confirmation bias. Scholars had theorized for a generation that a religious history phase Vermeer must have existed. When a painting that fit that theoretical hole appeared, they wanted it to be real. They saw what they expected to see. Question 2. How many other Van Meegerens are out there? Van Meegeren admitted to 14 forgeries during his trial. Subsequent research has identified at least 7 full-scale forgeries by him in museum and private collections. Several more works once attributed to Vermeer, Frans Hals, or Pieter de Hooch have been removed from artists' catalogs over the decades because they look like Van Meegeren's hand. We do not know with certainty that all his forgeries have been identified. Some may still be hanging on museum walls, in private homes, in church collections, classified as Vermeer or as workshop. Conservation science has improved enormously since 1947, but the bar for re-examining a painting that has hung uncontroversially as a Vermeer for 100 years is high. Question 3. What is forgery for? Van Meegeren said he started out wanting to humiliate the critics. By the end, he was just chasing the money, but the deeper thing his career demonstrated, and the thing that still matters, is that art historical attribution is a fundamentally human activity vulnerable to the same biases, hopes, and self-deceptions as everything else. Connoisseurship can be wrong, provenance can be invented. Even when forensic science catches up, the next generation of forgers will find the next gap. Han van Meegeren beat the system. He was caught only because he chose to be caught, because the alternative was a Dutch firing squad. If the war had ended differently, if Goering had escaped to South America with his painting, Christ and the Adulteress might still hang in a museum somewhere, attributed to Vermeer, drawing crowds and scholars and tour groups. How many other paintings hang in museums somewhere right now, attributed to a great master, painted in fact by a frustrated craftsman whose name nobody knows? The honest answer is, we don't know, and we may never know,